Now here comes the fun stuff. The Man Who Was Thursday. This novel will send you reeling the first time that you read it. It is very confusing. You're supposed to be confused. If you remember what Chesterton said in Orthodoxy, that the right response to the world is humility and gratitude, then the feeling that you are going to experience in this book is humility. It should be humbling. You can't understand what is happening. And that is exactly his point. So as you enter reading this novel, or as you finish the novel, recognize that feeling of confusion and maybe even humiliation and not understanding what is going on is exactly what he's trying to do to you. He is not trying to just pet your conscience or make you feel good about the world. He's not just trying to give you a nice, touchy-feely version of Christianity. He is exploring, and as I've mentioned before in his biography, Chesterton is writing this in a period where he himself was going through darkness, but comes out on the other side. So he may have written this over the course of 10 years, according to some biographers, where he started with the dark picture and comes out into the light by the end of it. But he's not afraid to face the darkness in the book. And so the book has that feeling of moving through darkness and confusion and hopefully coming out and being exposed to light. And that is its point. So let's walk through The Man Who Was Thursday and see what Chesterton is doing in this novel. How is it that he's turning us all on our heads? The Man Who Was Thursday begins with two poets of Saffron Park. So a couple of things to mention here. Poetry was not necessarily something that we see being performed in the park, so we have to almost think of this as like spoken word poets or lyricists, rappers, people who are street performers is almost the way of understanding this. And these are two poets that are kind of competing for the same corner. And they are giving their two different ways of looking at the world. Now, their two perspectives will bookend the entire novel. So the two things that we see at the beginning, we are going to come back to that same vision. So don't lose this idea of Gabriel Syme and Lucian Gregory. Lucian is a direct allusion to Lucifer. Chesterton was highly influenced by Charles Dickens. He wrote a whole book on Dickens. And this idea of the name indicates the person is really playing out here in what could almost be called an allegory, that the names have meanings for things directly. They're very Dickensian monikers for all of these characters. So Gabriel is our angel messenger, right, who is going to announce the good things to the world. And Lucian is our fallen angel or our accuser, as we will come to see him in the story. And the two of them at the beginning are talking about two different ways of viewing reality. Lucian Gregory says that the world is supposed to be chaos and disorder and destruction. And he sees poetry as a way of just expressing this chaos and this disorder. Whereas Gabriel Syme says, no, poetry is actually, you go to an underground and you want to get off at Victoria, you wonder if it's actually going to make it there, and lo and behold, it does. And so if we can read this figuratively, it's as though knowing a meter, and you want it to follow a meter, and it's what gives order to creation or meaning, as what we saw in Orthodoxy. So for example, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you rhyme. You have to have the word that actually connects with star for someone to feel like the meter and the rhyme were completed. If instead you end with two syllables where there should be one, if you end with a word that doesn't rhyme with the one before, that's confusion and chaos. It's not satisfactory. It doesn't seem to fit. It doesn't seem to work. And that's the vision of reality that Lucian Gregory is offering versus the ordered, the metered, the beautiful meaning that is offered by Gabriel Syme. And so we have the two competing worldviews that are going to actually play out in the whole course of the story as two different ways of being in the world. You also have mention of the anarchists in the beginning of the book. That is, this is again one of those, we have to read it figuratively as well as literally. Literally, there were anarchists at this time. So if anyone's familiar with Elizabeth I, the Empress of Hungary, she was assassinated by an anarchist. It was a man who just wanted to assassinate someone famous, and so he assassinated her. Later, I think it's her nephew, who's Archduke Ferdinand I, who gets assassinated, and it begins World War I. So the anarchists were not some pretend threat. They were a reality that Chesterton was living through. One way might be thinking of them, of the terrorist attacks in the first few decades of the 2000s that we're living through, where people from radical Islamist groups are actually attacking and are living violently, right? The jihads and so forth. That same kind of presence is what he's talking about with the anarchists, where bombs are being blown up in squares, and who are these anarchists and why are they doing what they're doing? And of course, we get to see that Gregory is revealed to be an anarchist. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Next is the idea of mystery. This is a mystery novel. You could not have had mystery novels really before the 19th century. And the reason why was the Industrial Revolution. We have the Industrial Revolution, and it moves everybody into the cities. This is a quick history of ideas that you can explore further if you want to. I'm only going to lay the groundwork of them and not really dig into them because they don't mean a whole lot for our discussion of the Inklings, but let me just give you some context. And so we have cities are the new things where you are surrounded by strangers instead of neighbors, where you don't know the people you are interacting with on a daily basis. You don't even know the routes and the roads. They're not the roads that your grandfather walked. They are alleys, there's hidden pathways, and this is going to be really the confines of the genre are what come up in The Man Who Was Thursday, where he uses some of these motifs and these ways of being in a mystery novel in this story. They're running around London and they're going between things, and people have masks and different faces, and who is everyone, right? Who are we? As he said in Orthodoxy, we have all forgotten who we are. So the mystery in this story is, who are we? And as you'll find out later, who is Sunday? And these are the great mysteries of this particular story. It's a sense of we have forgotten who we are. We don't know who our neighbors are. We don't know who anybody is, really. And that's where I want to look at this last piece of the puzzle before we really get into the novel. Masks and faces. If we have forgotten our names and our true identities, then all we are doing is living according to a false version of ourselves. Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote this poem called We Wear the Mask about the experience of African Americans having to hide who they truly are from the world in order to get by in a primarily white society. This poem, I think, elicits a lot of understanding of what Chesterton's talking about on a spiritual level. We wear the mask that grins and lies, it hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but O great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but of the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile, but let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. This suffering of African Americans is the same kind of suffering that Chesterton says all people are experiencing, the difference between masks and faces. So as you walk through The Man Who Was Thursday, highlight the places in which you see masks or faces talked about, identities known or identities exposed, identities changed from what they are. That is the mystery of the story, is to find out who we all are, and of course, who is Sunday, who will show us who we are. I may have given away too much there, but Augustine talks about this same kind of spiritual problem, that we have a disintegrated self, that we have two different selves, that we have two different wills. We have one face that is our true identity, and we have the mask that we show everyone else. In a sense, we are all imposters. We are all pretentious. We are all posing as what it is that we want to be without really knowing who we are. And The Man Who Was Thursday is exposing this lie and hopefully then guiding us towards the truth. The story begins, as I mentioned, between Lucian Gregory and Gabriel Syme. And the opening line says, it looked like a painting at the end of the world. And you see this impressionist painting of London by Monet. Chesterton was very thrown by the impressionist movement at first. He found it very disconcerting. And it was really the ideas behind it that bothered him most. If the world was only how we each saw it and what the impression was, then what was the point of things? And he worried that you would dig behind the impression and find nothing. Whereas in reality, if you look at an Impressionist painting, you can see that this is London. You cannot look at the Impressionist painting by Monet and say, oh, that must be New York City, or oh, that's a forest or a pastoral, or oh, that's a collection of apples. And so you could look behind the impression and find what was absolute. So Impressionist did not mean to take away the sense of the absolute, but for Chesterton it did. It completely unmoored him from what was objective versus what was subjective. And we'll see this in the story. What is the objective truth versus what is the subjective, and what are the relationships between those two things? The two artists that we've already talked about a little bit, but if you look at them very closely, you see this caricature that he's creating. You're seeing this dichotomy. One of them is a walking blasphemy, and the other is a mild-looking mortal. On one side, we have a person who is this grotesque angel and ape, right? It's the fallen Lucifer. And on the other side, you just have a plain Joe. That's what he's supposed to be, at least. We have the disorder and the revolt, as we mentioned, and the revolt is not merely just getting rid of poetic order, but also getting rid of police, of kings, and ultimately to abolish God himself as the supreme authority that we no longer have any use for. In contrast to this, we have Gabriel Syme, who revolted from infancy, but noticed that everyone around him was revolting, and he revolted into the only thing left, which was sanity. And so this goes back to orthodoxy with the idea of the maniac, the last sane person in the world who revolts against the madness that he sees around him, and thus becomes the only sane person alive. And so Gabriel Syme is kind of also not just our everyman, but our stand-in for Chesterton himself. He's the last sane person in a mad, mad world. The idea of the grotesque is central to The Man Who Was Thursday. Each of the characters, as we receive our description of them, look very grotesque for us. They seem like gargoyles of people. Sunday himself, when he is described from the back, appears as a great mountain of a man. He's colossal. He's abnormally tall, right? Enormously in his original proportions. He is vast, right? The only sense that we get of Sunday is his largeness or his hugeness. Again, I want to point out, when you get to Lewis's That Hideous Strength, you will get a sense of hugeness in the room with Ransom and Jane. And though she doesn't know what the hugeness refers to, we have this looming shadow maybe of Chesterton's hugeness of Sunday. Monday is called the secretary. He's described like a waxwork with a spasm of a smile. Tuesday is described as hairy. He's the eyes of a Skye Terrier coming out of the head of a revolutionary. The Wednesday, Marquis de Eustache, which just makes you think of Mr. Mustache or Sir Mustache. He's fashionable with his black beard and dark, sensuous red mouth. Friday is Professor de Worms, the less dissolution is senile decay, right? We have worms, someone to be eaten. It's making fun of the academy as this rationalist, materialist world that just deserves to die, right? So that we have that caricature of what it means to be an academic. And Saturday is also named Bull, and he's well-groomed like a medical practitioner with his black lasses and his grin. And so when we're first introduced to all of these characters and we see them at the anarchist council, they appear to us grotesque, almost cartoonish versions of human beings. And each of them seem to have a cartoonish name: Professor de Worms, Bull, Sir Mustache. All of them seem to be out of the ordinary. And as we mentioned from the beginning of the book, it is like a surreal dream. It's like an impressionist painting. And so this fits with that same idea as we get midway through the novel, that everything is about impressions. Everything is about how Gabriel Syme is seeing it, right? And how he's imagining things, and his imagination is showing him certain ways of seeing who's in front of him. So we'll stop there with the anarchist council and our descriptions of these grotesque characters, and then get to see what happens next.